This is from The Guardian. Israel court orders end of nationwide strike called over handling of hostage talks.
Israel's first nationwide general strike since October 7th, which was convened in support of a deal to free hostages held in Gaza, has ended after 8 hours with a court order for workers to go back to their jobs. The strike was organized amid widespread public anger at the government's handling of the war in Gaza after the discovery of the bodies of 6 hostages at the weekend. It was called by Israel's largest trade union, Histadrut, from 6 a.m. on Monday, closing government and municipal offices as well as schools and many private businesses. Israel's international airport, Ben Gurion, was reported to have shut down at 8 a.m. local time for 2 hours. The Tel Aviv Labor Court ordered an end to the strike on Monday, ruling that it was publicly motivated and had not been called for economic reasons. The chair of Histadrut, Arnon Bar-David, said in a statement before the strike, "I have come to the conclusion that only our intervention can shake those who need to be shaken. The deal is not progressing due to political considerations, and this is unacceptable." The Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich.
Smotrich.
I don't even want to say that. Yeah. The Israeli. He doesn't deserve a first name.
He sounds like a fucking demon. Bezalel Smotrich. That is the best villain name I've ever seen.
It looks like smoke.
Bez Smoke
Smoke
you.
Rich.
Smoke Trish.
Smoke Rich.
Smoke Rich.
The Israeli finance minister Smotrich, a far-right leader who opposes a truce in the war, was among those who called on the court to move to ban the strike. The strike action took place after tens of thousands of Israelis took to the streets on Sunday night, cutting off the Ayalon Highway, the motorway running through the heart of Tel Aviv, and lighting fires in the streets. A few dozen police officers tried to contain the protest, but were unable to push it back. Local media reported that 29 people had been arrested. The union called the strike after the Hostages and Missing Families Forum campaign group backed the idea in order to force the government to reach a deal for the return of the remaining hostages taken during Hamas's attack on October 7th. Israel's opposition leader Yair Lapid also supported the move. Were it not for the delays, sabotage, and excuses in the months of mediation efforts, the 6 hostages would likely still be alive, a statement from the group said, referring to the 6 Israeli hostages that were found dozens of meters underground in tunnels during the fighting in Rafah in southern Gaza. The military spokesperson Daniel Hagari said all 6 hostages were abducted alive on the morning of October 7th and brutally murdered by Hamas terrorists shortly before we reached them.
Oh, fucking shit.
As in, we got there right after our bullets reached them.
They bombed them, then they found their bodies. That's what happened. The idea for fucking liars.
I don't think Hamas killed them. What they wouldn't do is they wouldn't shoot their bargaining chip for a ceasefire. Because all they had was them. So.
Yeah.
They're not going to throw that away. I'm sorry. I'm not saying that human life is so, expendable, but nonetheless.
Are valuable to Hamas.
Yes.
So they're not just going to execute hostages. They're going to keep them as an asset to trade with Israel. So they're not just going to kill them. They were bombed. Mm-hmm. And they were bombed.
I don't even think that.
You just think that Israel just straight up shot them?
Yeah, I do.
I mean, you don't put it past them.
I really do.
I feel like if they seen me, they would just shoot me. I feel like they're going to drone my house anytime they want, to be honest, like the way the U.S. treats Israel.
Let's throw this out there now and get it done and over with. I am not suicidal.
I am not currently.
Well, you're supposed to say it so that whenever your body washes up, they don't be like, oh, it was a gas leak. Tipsy. Now, when I drink vodka, I get a tipsy. I don't get that. Because there's something specific about like that fireball, that specific heat in my stomach. I can't. It makes me instant. My stomach tries to turn inside out. It just makes me sick the whole time. And then I won't go through drinking it further until I get to the sedative type or sedative properties,
Having a fire in my tummy just brings back childhood memories.
Oh, man, you ain't see a shrink.
I ain't an on-call nurse.
Wait, isn't that kind of what I am?
Yeah, you're my handler.
Your handler.
because I'm mentally disabled.
However, the discoveries pointing to Hamas executions did little to deflect widespread fury towards Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition for failing to agree to a U.S.-backed hostage for peace deal with Hamas, which has been on the negotiating table since late May. The longtime Israeli leader has been repeatedly accused of stalling on a ceasefire deal for his own political gain. What kind of piece of shit would do that?
Yeah, he's not a partner for peace. He sabotaged every deal they had. Like Hamas has agreed to 5 different deals, and he keeps changing the conditions of the deal
To make them unagreeable.
to make them unagreeable, of course.
You can't be like, yeah, I agree to a ceasefire, but what that means is you're going to stop shooting us, we're going to keep bombing you, and you're going to bring us hostages, and we already killed yours. That's their idea of peace. That's Netanyahu's idea of peace.
Netanyahu just wants to keep the war going.
Well, now it's just to save his own fucking ass. So
Yeah. By the time this comes out, it'll probably be outed, or something different will happen.
Maybe he'll be, swinging from a courtyard or something.
Oof,
I don't know.
Oof.
On a swing set.
On a swing set, guys.
Maybe he'll be on a swing set in a courtyard. They still use ropes to tie swing sets together.
She's not real. I can make her disappear anytime. This is from Haaretz. For 11 months, Israel's boot has mercilessly pressed down on West Bank's neck. Of course, there's terror. Surprise, surprise, violent Palestinian resistance in the West Bank is raising its head. The human monsters have woken up from their slumber and started exploding. Suicide bombers have returned, and the host of Israeli pundits have learned an explanation. It's the Iranian money. Without it, the West Bank would be calm. With it, people are willing to commit suicide just to get their hands on some. It's all the Iranian octopus. How easy is it to attribute everything to Iran? Israelis love doing it. There is a devil, and he's Iranian, and he's to blame for everything. Maybe there is Iranian money, maybe there isn't, but the intensified struggle is the most predictable, understandable development, given what has been taking place in the West Bank for over 11 months of the Gaza war. The only surprise is that it didn't happen sooner. And there's a few headlines here. The Israeli army says it carried out airstrike in West Bank. Palestinians report 5 killed. Terror rises as Israel's right fuels the flames. West Bank is on the brink of explosion. West Bank car bombs. IDF says explosives came from same Hebron lab. 6 suspects arrested. Over the 11 months of war, Israel has ripped up the West Bank. Just as it's doing now with the roads in Tulkarm and Jenin, nothing is left of them. This is the hardest period the Palestinians have experienced since Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, even harder since it's taking place in the shadow of another attack, a more barbaric one, in Gaza. In contrast to Defensive Shield, the current assault has no reason or justification. Israel has exploited the war in Gaza to cause turmoil in the West Bank. The response was late in coming, but it now has arrived. The Israeli assault has 2 arms this time, the army and Shin Bet and border police on one hand, and violent settler militias on the other. The 2 arms are coordinated. They don't get in each other's way. Sometimes they blend into each other. When the stormtroopers from the outpost don uniforms, these are the emergency response teams, which grant legitimization to every program. The army takes care not to interfere neither in small nor large incidents. In this context, a statement by a senior military source who warned about settler violence over the weekend expressed unbelievable gall. Jewish terror is causing great damage to security in the West Bank, said the source, whose forces could and should have stopped Jewish terror a long time ago. There has not been a program in which soldiers weren't present and did nothing to stop it. Occasionally they take part in it, and the senior officer dares lament it. October 7th was not just a day of calamity for us, it was one for the Palestinians as well. There are no more words for describing what Israel has wrought in the Gaza Strip, but it didn't hold back in the West Bank either. With the encouragement of the Kahanis cabinet members and the silence of the Prime Minister, other ministers, and the public. This is from the BBC. Extremist settlers rapidly seizing West Bank land. Last October, Palestinian grandmother Aisha Shatea says a man pointed a gun at her head and told her to leave the place she had called home for 50 years. She told the BBC the armed threat was the culmination of an increasingly violent campaign of harassment and intimidation that began in 2021 after an illegal settler outpost was established close to her home in the occupied West Bank. The number of these outposts has risen rapidly in recent years, new BBC analyst shows. There are currently at least 196 across the West Bank, and 29 were set up last year, more than in any previous year. The outposts, which can be farms, clusters of houses, or even groups of caravans, often lack defined boundaries and are illegal under both Israeli and international law. But the BBC World Service has seen documents showing that organizations with close ties to the Israeli government have provided money and land used to establish new illegal outposts. The BBC has also analyzed open source intelligence to examine their proliferation and has investigated the settler who Aisha Shataya says threatened her. Experts say outposts are able to seize large swaths of land more rapidly than settlements and are increasingly linked to violence and harassment towards Palestinian communities. Official figures for the number of outposts do not exist, but BBC I reviewed lists of them and their locations gathered by Israeli anti-settlement watchdogs Peace Now and Kermet Nevat, as well as the Palestinian Authority, which runs the part of the occupied West Bank. We analyzed hundreds of satellite images to verify that outposts had been constructed at these locations and to confirm the year that they were set up. The BBC also checked social media posts, Israeli government publications, and news sources to corroborate this and to show that outposts were still in use. Our analysis suggests almost half, 89 of the 196 outposts, were verified to have been built since 2019. Some of these are linked to growing violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Earlier this year, the British government sanctioned 8 extremist settlers for inciting or perpetuating violence against Palestinians. At least 6 had established or are living on illegal outposts. A former commander of the Israeli army in the West Bank, Avi Mizrahi, says most settlers are law-abiding Israeli citizens, but he does admit the existence of outposts makes violence more likely. Whenever you put outposts illegally in the area, it brings tensions with the Palestinians living in the same area, he says. One of the extremist settlers sanctioned by the UK was Moshe Sharvet, the man Aisha says threatened her at the gunpoint. Both he and the outpost he set up less than 800 meters from Aisha's home were also sanctioned by the U.S. government in March. His outpost was described as a base from which he perpetuates violence against Palestinians. He's made our life hell, Aisha says, who now must live with her son in a town close to Nablus. Outposts lack any official Israeli planning approval, unlike settlements, which are larger, typically urban, Jewish enclaves built throughout the West Bank, legal under Israeli law. Both are considered illegal under international law, which forbids moving a civilian population into an occupied territory, but many settlers living in the West Bank claim that, as Jews, they have a religious and historical connection to the land. Were you part of the original 1948 Zionists that did the Nakba? Is that what you're talking about? In July, the UN's top court, in a landmark opinion, said Israelis should stop all new settlement activity and evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel rejected the opinion as fundamentally wrong and one-sided. Despite outposts having no legal status, there is little evidence that the Israeli government has been trying to prevent their rapid growth in numbers. The BBC has seen new evidence showing how 2 organizations with close ties to the Israeli state have provided money and land used to set up new outposts in the West Bank. One is the World Zionist Organization, an international body founded more than a century ago and instrumental in the establishment of the State of Israel. It had a settlement division responsible for managing large areas of land occupied by Israel since 1967. The division is funded entirely by Israeli public funds and describes itself as an arm of the Israeli state. Contracts obtained by Peace Now and analyzed by the BBC show the settlement division has repeatedly allocated land on which outposts have been built. In the contracts, the WZO forbids the building of any structures and says the land should only be used for grazing or farming, but satellite imagery reveals that in at least 4 cases, illegal outposts were built on it. One of these contracts was signed by Zvi Bar Yosef in 2018. He, like Moshe Sharvet, was sanctioned by the UK and US earlier this year for violence and intimidation against Palestinians. We contacted the WZO to ask if they were aware that multiple tracts of land it had allocated for grazing and farming were being used for the construction of legal outposts. It did not respond. We put out questions to Zvi Bar Yosef, but received no reply. The BBC has also uncovered 2 documents revealing that another key settler organization Amana loaned hundreds of thousands of shekels to help establish outposts. In one case, the organization loaned $270,000 to a settler to build greenhouses on an outpost considered illegal under Israeli law. Amana was founded in 1978 and has worked closely with the Israeli government to build settlements throughout the West Bank ever since. But in recent years, there has been growing evidence that Amana also supports outposts. In a recording from a meeting with executives in 2021 leaked by an activist, Amana CEO Ziv Hever can be heard stating that in the last 3 years, one operation we have expanded is the herding farm outposts. Today, the area they control is almost twice the size of built settlements. This year, the Canadian government included Amana in its round of sanctions against individuals and organizations responsible for violent and destabilization actions against Palestinian civilians and their property on the West Bank. The sanctions did not mention outposts. There is also a trend of the Israeli government retroactively legalizing outposts, effectively transforming them into settlements. Last year, for example, the government began the process of legalizing at least 10 outposts and granted at least 6 others full legal status. Gaining control over large areas, often at the expense of Palestinian communities, is a key goal for some settlers who set up and live on outposts, says Hajit Afran of Peace Now. Settlers who live on the hilltop outposts see themselves as protecting lands, and their daily job is to kick out Palestinians from the area, she says. That's genocide. That's human right violation. That's settler colonialism. I mean, could you imagine owning your home for 50 years and someone just at gunpoint takes it away from you? And there's nothing you can do about it. This is from Black Information Network. Felony charges dropped against 2 ex-officers charged in Breonna Taylor raid. A federal judge has dismissed felony charges against 2 former Louisville officers who were involved in the deadly raid of Breonna Taylor's home. Taylor, a 26-year-old black woman, was shot and killed in her apartment during a flawed, no-knock raid on March 13, 2020. Detective Joshua Janes and Sergeant Kyle Meany were charged in 2022 with submitting a false affidavit to search Taylor's home before the raid and creating a false cover story to avoid responsibility in her killing. Janes and Meany also faced felony charges for using a dangerous weapon to deprive Taylor of her Fourth Amendment right to defend herself against unreasonable search. Janes and Meany, who weren't present at the raid, were both fired by the Louisville Police Department. August 22nd, U.S. District Judge Charles Simpson ruled that there was no link between the warrantless entry of Taylor's home and her death. Say what? Simpson said the legal cause of Taylor's death was her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker's decision to open fire when officers burst into her home. Walker shot at officers believing they were intruders before police fired the lethal shots that killed Taylor. Simpson dismissed the felony charges against Janes and Meany, meaning they will avoid life sentences. Meany still faces one charge of false statement to federal investigators, which is punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Janes could face up 40 years if convicted on his remaining charges of 2 counts of falsifying of records, conspiracy to falsify records, and witness tampering. Former detectives Brett Hankison and Kelly Godlett are also facing federal charges in connection to Taylor's death. Goodlett pleaded guilty and is awaiting sentencing. Following Thursday's ruling, Taylor's family released a statement saying they were planning to appeal. The family is obviously devastated, Taylor's family said. Right now, we are just processing as prosecutors flush out next steps. We've been told they plan to appeal, and so we will wait for the appeals process to play out. Also, I remember that the Louisville Police Department boarded up state buildings and increased the budget by $700,000 right after this. This is just racism. This is the state protecting its enforcers. And the officers were at the wrong house, and the warrant wasn't even, like, there was something faulty with the warrant. I mean, where's the justice for Brown? This is from Real Change News, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy by Stephanie Kelton. The national debt is either a big scary number you believe is going to burden future generations if we don't get our spending under control, or you don't think about it very much. Whatever your personal relationship with the federal government's ever-increasing debt that is ballooning seemingly out of control actually does affect you, but not in the way you might think. In The Deficit Myth, Stephanie Kelton explains how politicians toss the national debt from one side of the aisle to the other as a bargaining tool to advocate for cutting the essential programs and social supports that keep millions of Americans, including children, single women who are heads of their households, and people with disabilities, out of absolute poverty. While the deficit myth may seem like an economics book, and there were parts I had to reread to understand. This is actually the ultimate social work text. As a current MSW student myself, I want to see this book on the curriculum of either a required policy or poverty and inequality courses. Kelton proposes a jobs program, advocates for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and that we actually fund them in perpetuity, and explains how the government's debt is actually the public surplus. I was skeptical when I heard the book's premise that our government doesn't actually have to balance its budget the way a household does. The government can never run out of money because it's a currency issuer. It alone has the power to create dollars whenever it wants. It's a common sentiment that printing large amounts of money is a bad thing because it causes inflation. There has been a lot of hand-wringing lately due to the now 3 COVID-19 relief packages Congress has passed, which have triggered the printing of trillions of dollars. 40% of all U.S. dollars currently in existence have been printed in last year. Conventional economics would portend massive increases in prices or inflation, possibly to the point of hyperinflation. But as Kelton explains with modern monetary theory, the existence of dollars by themselves does not cause inflation. Overspending, either on the government's or the private sector's part, does. I had to reread the chapters where Kelton explains how and why this is so, but taking the time to understand MMT is completely worth it. She's clear. MMT does not give the government a license to print however much money it wants, whenever it wants. She's advocating for spending based on our values rather than our budget. Since Uncle Sam has the illegal authority to create U.S. dollars, indeed he's the only one with that power, MMT frees us from the false constraints of balancing the federal government's budget the way individual households and even cities and states must. Acknowledging the differences between how a currency issuing government relates to money and how a private citizen does allows us to have conversations about what we value rather than argue about cutting budgets of vital programs due to an ultimately imaginary lack of funding. This theory sounded wild to me at first, and I admittedly still have some questions about it, such as how well it would hold up if when the US dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, as many fiscal and economic experts and lay speculators alike predict will happen soon. But the US military actually already approaches its budget through an MMT lens. Fiscal increases are easily approved without always knowing where the money will come from. In the deficit myth, Kelton is simply suggesting that we apply the same process to other types of spending and start having conversations about what we value and about those programs rather than where the money will come from. MMT is not new or that obscure a theory. Even Alan Greenspan has made comments that reveal an MMT philosophy, but it was new to me and the friend who recommended it to me. I can't help but wonder if our ignorance of it is by design. MMT is absolutely worth considering and trying to understand. If it's viable and if people can figure it out, MMT has the power to transform the physical and political climate in this country and address some of the most significant issues our country has wrestled with since its start. I think the only way we really solve climate might be through MMT. It's always so cringe when Republicans bring up the national debt. Or it's like the same white libertarians. This is from NPR. These disabled people tried to play by the rules. It cost them their federal benefits. The thing that got Karen Williams into trouble was that she tried to do the responsible thing and bought a life insurance policy that would pay for her funeral. The Philadelphia woman had seen family members scramble to find money, begging friends or starting GoFundMe campaigns to pay the high cost of burying a loved one. Williams didn't want to burden her children. She had no idea that buying the insurance would get her caught up in an antiquated federal rule as an asset limit that snares more than 100,000 of America's poorest disabled and elderly every year, often with dire consequences. Williams, who is disabled and doesn't work, relied upon a little-known federal assistance program, Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, run by the Social Security Administration. It sends monthly benefit checks. The average amount is $700 to 7.4 million of the nation's neediest disabled and elderly to help them pay for rent, food, medicine, and other everyday needs. The program started 51 years ago, but updated little since then. Is hampered by out-of-date rules such as the limit of assets. Williams, 63, thought her life insurance wouldn't be used until after she died. She didn't understand it had a cash value, and she could turn it in and collect $1,900. That was far less than the $10,000 in funeral expenses she bought the policy to cover when she died. For Williams, the cash value of her policy, along with the $260 she had saved in her checking account, pushed her over SSI's $2,000 limit on how much a recipient is allowed in savings and other assets. That $2,000 asset limit hasn't changed since 1989. If it had kept up over the 51 years with inflation, it would be $10,000 today. I would have definitely went by the rules, Williams said. I didn't know I was breaking them. The penalty was stiff. Williams was kicked off of SSI, her primary source of income, and told by Social Security to pay back 2 years of benefits totaling $20,000. She had 30 days to pay it back. The impact of it is just cruel, says Kathleen Romig. Romig recently went to work as a senior advisor to the Commission of Social Security. She works on making programs like SSI fairer to children. When NPR interviewed her last year, she wasn't speaking for Social Security or SSI. She worked at a Washington think tank, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, as the director of Social Security and Disability Policy, where she wrote about raising SSI's asset limit or ending it altogether. SSI is stuck in the past, Romig said. It's hardly been changed over 50 years. An NPR investigation finds SSI is deeply in need of modernization. It was intended to lift people out of poverty when it was intended to lift people out of poverty when it was created in 1972 and started paying benefits for the first time in 1974. Instead, because of the asset limit and other rigid and rusty rules, SSI has become a forgotten safety net that keeps many of its recipients stuck in poverty. NPR interviewed roughly about 200 people, including those who depend on SSI, lawyers who get them, experts who study SSI and poverty, Social Security officials, staff, and others. Among our findings, SSI's SSI's asset limit and other rules are so out of date that many of the poorest Americans who need SSI the most are excluded from the program, largely because of the asset limit. SSI sends out benefit checks to impoverished beneficiaries, but then often months or years later tells them there's been a mistake and they need to pay back the money, which it calls overpayments. SSI's asset limit and other rules impose a substantial marriage penalty on recipients, forcing many to skip marriage or lose benefits when they do marry. For many, the marriage penalty comes with even more calamitous results than losing a monthly benefit check. Many beneficiaries depend on the Medicaid eligibility that is automatic in most states for someone who qualifies for SSI, but then risk losing Medicaid if they marry. Social Security is not set up to the task of administering such a complex system. After years of budget constraints imposed by Congress, it is understaffed and hurt by an antiquated computer system and the extreme administrative burden of calculating the asset limit of other SSI rules. In Philadelphia, Karen Williams was caught off guard when in 2019 she got a letter from Social Security telling she needed to come to the local office. That's where Williams was told she was over the $2,000 limit on assets, and she had been for a long time. Someone at Social Security had noticed she'd accumulated $260 in her checking account, and she had spotted her life insurance policy with this $1,900 cash value. Social Security staff knew about the policy because when Williams told them about it, when someone gets approved for SSI, they give Social Security the right to check their bank accounts and monitor other records of assets. She had purchased the policy before she went to SSI and used her SSI benefits to pay the premium, according to Williams and her attorneys. At the Social Security office, Williams was told she'd been over the asset limit for the previous 2 years. As a result, she was issued an overpayment notice to pay back all the benefit checks she received in that time. She owed $20,000 and she had 30 days to pay it back. That was impossible. Williams was impoverished. She was disabled and didn't work. That's why she qualified for SSI. You're telling me I owe you $20,000, Williams remembered thinking, oh, Social Security office. I can't even pay my bills. Where am I going to live? Social Security allows a few exceptions to what gets counted as an asset. A recipient and their immediate family living with them can own one car and a home. There are ways to put money into trusts or get waivers, but that's tricky and often requires hiring a lawyer. There's an exception for burial insurance, but insurance for funerals often gets sold as life insurance, like the policy Williams bought. Williams said Social Security workers gave her a contradictory and even wrong advice about how she could resolve the issue with the policy to cover funeral expenses. Ultimately, she sought out the help of Gregory Burrell, president and CEO of the Terry Funeral Home, an institute in West Philadelphia that has served black families for generations. Burrell let Williams turn the policy over to the funeral home. We see that in that time, Burrell, a former president of the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, the largest group of black funeral directors, said of the conclusion that caught Williams, unfortunately, people don't know any better, and they're stressing, And these insurance policies, they're considered assets. Burrell and Williams talked about how their own parents and grandparents purchased burial insurance, putting aside small amounts, sometimes just 50 cents a month, to hand the agent who regularly knocked on their door and initialed their savings book to note the payment. It was one of the few kinds of insurance black families could buy, and both Burrell and Williams say seeing their parents and grandparents saving taught them the importance of financial responsibility. It was deeply embarrassing for Williams when she lost her SSI checks. It was the middle of the pandemic. She got by with them from her she got by with the help from her children and friends. She says the stress of losing her SSI check, her primary source of income, led to health problems, including 2 hospitalizations for heart attacks. Williams found a lawyer at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia who helped her challenge the big bill she got for SSI. Last year, Social Security conceded it made a mistake and had not properly told Williams of her right to appeal. Her lawyers asked for and won the agency's agreement to waive the $20,000 overpayment, but then her lawyers said the agency ignored its own decision and reissued the overpayment charge. The attorneys appealed again, and the order to pay is now on hold. In addition, her lawyers were able to move Williams to a different Social Security retirement program, one without an asset limit, and she started receiving benefits again. But Williams still feels stressed over not knowing whether she will be expected to repay that money she doesn't have. If this sounds confusing, it is, and her case shows that SSI's asset limit and her rules are so complex that not even Social Security staff can always get things right. Recipients usually need to find an attorney to help them negotiate the process, but the attorneys are hard for poor people to afford or find. Also, few lawyers take SSI cases because Social Security puts a low cap on how much they can earn from such cases. It's really tiresome. I am so through with this, Williams said, and I believe that a lot of people just give up. On average, 70,000 beneficiaries have had their benefits suspended every year, according to Romick, the policy expert now at the Social Security Administration, and 40,000 have had their benefits terminated. The low asset limit, Romick said, penalizes people when they try to save. We know that saving is good, she said. We know that we can use savings to invest in things that can make people's lives better. For example, education or safe and stable housing. We know that saving is necessary for that, and yet we're prohibiting some of the poorest, most vulnerable people from doing just that. Jennifer Burdick, an attorney at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, says the low asset limit traps people in poverty. You need to be poor and stay poor in order to get these benefits, she said. It's a disincentive against saving and being responsible in this way. It's a disgrace. Burdick once represented a family that needed to fix the roof that collapsed on their house and took a small loan from a friend. Social Security counted the loan as an asset and cut off the benefits that went to the family's disabled son. NPR heard dozens of similar stories from SSI recipients and their lawyers of people desperately in need of the government's benefits who got kicked off or couldn't get on because they couldn't stay under the low asset limit. Peter Belletti of Deer Park, New York, fought Social Security for years after he was denied SSI benefits because he owns a timeshare in the Poconos, one that he argued is worthless. He tried to sell it without success and showed proof to Social Security. One obstacle to selling it, he owns it with his ex-wife. The best he can offer a buyer is 3.5 days of the week. The best he can offer a buyer is 3.5 days of the week she uses it. But he said Social Security staff in Long Island insisted that he needs to sell it. That's why I was told by my caseworker there, Valerity said, because you still have the timeshare, you're ineligible, period. Have a nice day. An Illinois man who asked to be anonymous for fear of retaliation told he feels trapped living in his unsafe and run-down apartment because he saved up for the down payment for on a new place. Social Security said he was over the asset limit and moved to end his SSI. A Holocaust survivor in Virginia received a reparations check from Germany last year, and when Social Security spotted the extra money in his bank account, it moved to end his SSI. Holocaust reparations are excluded from calculating federal benefits, but it took the intervention of an attorney to sort it out. In Georgia, Stacey Ramirez says Social Security suddenly stopped sending SSI checks to her 29-year-old autistic son Ryan last year. The agency, in a letter, said its review found $1,400 in 2 bank accounts. But Ramirez says Social Security got it wrong, and there were no accounts in her son's name or Social Security number at those banks, something she says the banks confirmed to her. Still, Social Security demanded that her son repay 3 months of SSI checks, a total of $3,000. Then Ramirez says, just as mysteriously and without notice, Ryan was put back on SSI and sent 3 checks for exactly $3,000, but Social Security still demanded a repayment of $3,000. Ramirez says her son was able to stay in his apartment only because his family had money to pay his rent when his income was cut off. One irony: Ramirez and her husband, Dan Crimmins, are professional disability consultants who help families apply for SSI benefits. Social Security eventually relented after Ramirez documented months of research and calls to multiple agency staffers. The system is so broken, says Ramirez, it can't support itself, much less the people who desperately need the support. SSI's origins go back to Richard Nixon. In 1969, the Republican president proposed replacing the existing federal welfare system with a guaranteed basic income of monthly vouchers to impoverished Americans. Nixon's plan faced opposition from many conservatives and liberals, and after 3 years of revisions, failed to get through Congress. But one part of Nixon's plan survived and became supplemental security income and monthly benefits to disabled, blind, and elderly people. These were considered the deserving poor. SSI was an early version of that. In the last few years, has become an increasingly popular strategy for fighting poverty to provide impoverished people with a guarantee of monthly income. There are now 150 of these guaranteed income experiments, sponsored mostly by philanthropists and sometimes by the state or local government, that have spread across the country in just the last few years. SSI is the OG guaranteed income plan, says Rebecca Velez of the nonpartisan National Academy of Social Insurance, using slang for original gangster to refer to SSI as the original guaranteed income program. The new experiments show where SSI, with many of its strings attached, went wrong, she says, with all its dehumanizing and hyper-restrictive eligibility criteria. For most people, those monthly SSI checks provide a survival income, Velez says. This is money that people spend on rent. This is money that people spend on food, on co-pays, on their medications, on the kinds of basic needs, on their kids' basic needs. That's where the money goes. Today, 7.4 million people receive those monthly SSI benefits. Only 43% of those who apply get accepted for SSI, and Social Security Administration offices determines whether an applicant meets the asset limit. A state disability determination service officer determines whether the person's disability is significant enough to limit work and other basic life activities. The wait times to get approved for disability benefits are long, almost doubling during the pandemic when Social Security closed its offices. One congressional report found that some 10,000 people die every year while they wait to get on SSI or a disability program for people with work history. Of those who collect SSI benefits, 84% are eligible because of a significant disability. There are 1 million children who receive SSI benefits. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1990 expanded eligibility for children. Policy changes in 1984 expanded eligibility for people with mental illness. In addition, a little more than 2 million impoverished people 65 or older get SSI. As SSI expanded to include more children and people with mental illness, critics worried that the program was growing too quickly and encouraged people to depend upon federal welfare. SSI's rolls peaked a decade ago and then fell after Congress and Social Security tightened eligibility reviews and kept the low asset limit in place. Jack Smulligan, a senior policy fellow at the Urban Institute, says SSI serves the poorest of the poor. More than half have no other income. As a result, he says, those who get SSI gain a lot. Sometimes it lifts families out of poverty. They also have a lot to lose if they get kicked off. Smulligan's research colleague, Chantel Bowens, says that of the poorest Americans, SSI can be more critical than other governmental assistance programs. Those may pay for food or energy bills, but SSI is your monthly income, she says. It's what you live on. If I lose it, do I have a roof over my head for my kids? The stakes for SSI are very high. One absurdity of SSI's asset limits, says Boyens, is that people lose SSI benefits when they're below the poverty line. A disproportionate number of recipients are African American and Latino. Among work-age recipients of SSI, 32.8% are Black. For children, 36.8% are Black, and 26.2% are Latino. People of color on SSI are even more poor than white recipients. SSI, a $61 billion program in 2023, is funded out of the general tax revenues. It is not funded by the trust funds that support better-known parts of Social Security, like the checks it sends 53 million retirees and their dependents, or Social Security disability insurance. which supports 8.5 million people who leave the workforce because of a disability. Unlike SSI's frozen rules, the amount of the monthly benefit checks does change from year to year to reflect inflation. In 2024, the maximum monthly benefit is $1,000 for an individual and $1,500 for a couple. The average benefit for an individual is $700. Most states and the District of Columbia add a small supplement, an average of $145 in 2022 to disabled or older persons as a check. When SSI was created, Congress said its purpose was to provide a positive assurance that the nation's aged, blind, and disabled people would no longer have to subsist on below poverty level incomes. But today, the maximum SSI check takes recipients to just 75% of the poverty line. The asset limit was controversial from the beginning. There seems to be a strong element of punishment associated with these tests, an economist wrote in a review of SSI commissioned by Congress on the program's 10th anniversary. Recipients of SSI, he said, are required to enter in a state of pauperization with all in its negative aspects. This is done as a punishment for having to seek help for the rest of society and as a warning and a hence deterrent to others. Katie Saban, an assistant professor of social work at California State University, Sacramento, says now SSI's stalled asset limit adds to that stigma. People must limit their own opportunities for work and marriage, submit to continuous surveillance of their finances, health, and personal affairs, and survive on poverty-level income without ever having more than $2,000 in assets, Saban says. Last year, Gabriela Guerrero of St. Louis passed the bar. She opened her own law firm, but quickly had to stop taking clients. I really had to limit what I was doing and haven't taken on any new cases because I'm really afraid, she says. She's afraid of something that other lawyers don't have to worry about, that she'll make too much money, which in her case means just $2,000, the SSI limit. Guerrero was born with spinal muscular atrophy, a condition that causes weakened muscles. Nurses come to Guerrero's home 12 hours every day. Personal care assistants are scheduled, when she can find them, several hours more. I'm not able to do any of my own care, so brushing my teeth, washing my face, give me a shower, she says. Just all the basics that you physically do for yourself. Most importantly, she requires nurses and aides to run and monitor the technology that keeps her healthy and out of the hospital or a nursing home. There's her feeding tube and the ventilator that keeps her breathing at night. She needs a nurse to operate the machine that suctions her lungs several times a day. Without that assistance, I would just be dead, says Guerrero. There's not really another way I would function, but it's all tied to SSI. In most states, someone who is eligible for SSI is automatically qualified for Medicaid, the state and federal health insurance for people with little income. It's Medicaid that pays for Guerrero's nurses and aides. Private insurance, the kind that people get through work, typically won't cover in-home personal care assistants and nurses. Guerrero's only other option would be to make enough money to pay for her aides and nurses out of her own pocket. But the cost for that level of assistance she gets, Guerrero calculates, would run between $100,000 and $200,000 a year, and she doubts that she could make that much. So to keep her SSI and the Medicaid that's tied to it, Guerrero is required to stay under the $2,000 asset limit. Guerrero is 33. She was born 6 months after President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disability Act law in 1990, proclaiming, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." When SSI was created in 1972, they were very different and much lower expectation for the lives of disabled people. SSI, for example, predates the law passed in 1975 that first gave disabled people the right to go to school and get an education. Before then, more than 1 million disabled children were excluded from schools. SSI came years before the ADA, which banned discrimination at work, on public transportation, or access to public places like to restaurants and movie theaters. We've made a lot of progress over the last 50 years as disabled people, Guerrero says. We went from being mostly institutionalized, not going to school, not going to public places, but there's still one basic right that Guerrero misses, solely because she needs SSI. She can't marry without substantial risk. It is difficult for someone who gets an SSI check to marry and stay under the asset limit because a spouse's income isn't counted. Where a single person on SSI is allowed up to $2,000 in assets, the limit for a couple is only $3,000. That's another limit that hasn't budged since 1989. Both asset limits for individual and couples were raised by Congress in 1984 from $1,500 for an individual and $2,250 for a couple, but the new levels didn't take effect until 1989. NPR interviewed dozens of people who said their only options were to marry and lose SSI, marry and then lie about the relationship, or to close themselves off from romantic relationships altogether. Gabero has been involved with her partner, Juan Johnson, for several years, but they can't make plans to marry. She'd like that commitment, plus, she grew up in a religious family where marriage was important. Several years ago, Gabero says her caseworker at Social Security asked if we were sharing a bedroom. Gabero ducked the question. My heart was pounding when she asked that because I didn't know if I was about to get in trouble. The caseworker dropped the issue, but Gabero says she realized the government worker had all the power over my life that she could ever want. Under Social Security's rules, a couple doesn't need to be legally married for a disabled person to lose SSI. Just living as if they were married, called holding out, is enough to get counted as a couple under the 3,000 asset limit. One woman, who asked to stay anonymous, told NPR she married but then divorced her husband to stay on SSI. Currently, the man doesn't work and does a lot of her caregiving. They still spend most of the time together, but they keep separate apartments. When the woman's state caseworker comes for a visit, she says she takes down all the photographs of her and her apartment, of her and her partner. Wow, what the fuck? What the fuck? Social Security said it could not provide data of how many people lose SSI for violating the hold out rule or for marrying. NPR could not find recent examples of people who lost their SSI for living as a couple, but found dozens of disabled people who hide their relationships or say they avoid them altogether. Nobody should be afraid to say they're in a relationship with somebody, says Gabero, comparing the situation to the fight for the legalization of interracial marriage in 1967 and the marriage for same-sex couples in 2015. In law school, Gabero wrote a law review article about SSI's so-called marriage penalty. The choice disabled people must make is always simple. It is a choice between marital happiness and medical necessity, she concluded. The American dream is supposed to be open to everyone, regardless of status, and achieving it includes having a fully formed family to come home to at the end of the day. I'm mentally disabled, so I get it. I'm fighting disability right now. This is from Reason. It's been easy to forget how bad Kamala Harris is, but I'm here to remind you. President Joe Biden dropped out of the 2024 presidential race amid concern from fellow Democrats that he stood no chance of beating Donald Trump this go around. I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down, Biden posted on X before shortly after throwing his full support and endorsement behind Vice President Kamala Harris becoming the party's new nominee. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump, Biden added, let's do this. But can Harris do this? It's hard to conclude that Harris would far worse than Biden, whose cognitive difficulties were so apparent his own party came to view him as a serious electoral liability. Yet if one recalls Harris' own ill-fated run at the Democratic nomination in 2020 and her time in politics before then, the math in this equation becomes somewhat fuzzier. Harris was a truly bad candidate, and prior to that, she perpetuated some truly bad policies. Kamala Harris is a horrible campaigner, and Kamala Harris, the cop, can be an easy target, can be easy to forget if you are only considering what Harris has done lately. Her tenure as vice president has been almost entirely unremarkable. The most distinguishing feature has been a series of bizarre but benign word salads, and political memory is short. So Harris isn't the best orator, surely that's surmountable. Besides, the lack of distinguishing actions during her vice presidency could even be to her advantage. She's basically a blank slate, at least if you don't look back too far. But what if you do look back? The first thing you'll see is Harris's shambolic 2020 campaign for president. She wouldn't commit to policy positions. She couldn't defend her past actions. There were ongoing stories about her poor treatment of her staff. She entered the race as a top-tier candidate with glowing press and some big-time backers, and dropped out 2 months later before the Iowa caucuses, polling at just 3% nationally. She wasn't even polling as a top-tier candidate in her home state of California. It was impossible in that campaign to ascertain what Harris stood for. This wasn't just a case of national campaigning jitters. One major thread in Harris's career, including during her days as District Attorney of San Francisco and Attorney General of California, has been flip-flopping on issues to suit her audience or the political moment. This may have worked as a short-term strategy, but it left a long-term impression of her as a rudderless and ruthless, a phony. It will be incredibly easy for Republicans to portray her as someone who stands for nothing, or as whatever it is they think you'll hate most, like a representative of California socialism. The image of Harris as slippery, all ambition, no ideology may contribute to her unpopularity among American voters. It's almost certainly more of a liability than the once common critique that Harris was an overzealous cop and drug warrior. Harris's tough on crime past makes her unpopular among leftists, and more radical wings of the Democratic Party, as well as among civil libertarians and criminal justice reformers. There's no doubt that this has become back to haunt her again. She would become the Democratic nominee. But this past May have been especially hurtful in 2020 when the protests inspired by George Floyd's death were still raging and the criminal justice reform momentum was still vibrant. Remember to defund the police? And it likely mattered more in a Democratic primary than it would in a general election, since the types that find fault with Harris's prosecutional record are unlikely to find Trump and Republicans a more welcome alternative. If anything, some of the lip service Harris paid to progressive justice ideals, both in 2020 and in California, may be used by Republicans to help turn safety-minded independents against her. That means Harris's turnabouts on justice issues, not her actual record, may wind up harming her the most. It leaves her vulnerable to attacks from both left and the right on this front, to allegations that she's been both too aggressive and too lenient on crime, even if only one of these has been born out of just words. I won't pretend to know whether Harris would be a better or worse choice for Democrats than some other potential candidates. I don't know whether she could beat Trump, though I have my doubts. What I do know is that Harris becomes the party's nominee. The rush to anoint her a saint in the press, on social media, among celebrities is going to kick into overdrive, both because of her identity and out of a desperation to avoid Trump getting elected again. But as much as I want to see a female president sooner rather than later, and as much as I do not want to see another Trump presidency, I can't pretend Harris doesn't have serious and worrying flaws. As much as she's been a pretty benign figure during her vice presidential days, there's nothing to stop her worst tendencies from flaring up again if she becomes president. These tendencies include a penchant for saying one thing during campaigns and then doing the opposite, of using the state to crack down on problems like truancy and drug use that many would agree could be better solved through non-punitive approaches, and of using moral panics around sex in self-serving ways, even while publicly ignoring sexual misconduct among California cops. They include acting cavalierly toward the Constitution, defending dirty prosecutors, and finding new ways for the government to poke into people's lives. Remember, not only Harris helped put the parents of truant kids in jail, but she wrote in her 2019 book that the truth that we hold, instituting a statewide plan on truancy, was part of the reason I'd run for the office in the first place. That is who Kamala Harris is, though she claims the jailing was unintended. Those who critique Harris for being something of a politically ambitious cipher aren't wrong, but this image is incomplete. There are other things Harris has stood for consistently, and none of them are good. I'll leave you with something I wrote about Harris back in 2019. During her 28-year tenure as a county prosecutor, district attorney, and state attorney general in the public eye, she spoke of racial justice and liberal values, bolstering her cred as one of the Democratic Party's rising stars. But behind closed doors, she repeatedly fought for a more aggressive prosecution, not just of violent criminals, but of people who committed misdemeanors and quality of life crimes. Every attorney general fights for state power and police prerogatives. It's part of the job. But over and over again, Harris went beyond the call of duty, fighting for harsher sentences, larger bail requirements, longer prison terms, more prosecution of petty crimes, greater criminal justice involvement in low-income and minority communities, less due process for people in the system, less transparency, and less accountability for bad cops. In the early days of her 2020 presidential campaign, Harris sought to define herself as a liberal reformer who has kept up with the times. But a review of her career shows a distinct penchant for power, seeking an illiberal disposition in which no offense is small or harmless enough to warrant lenience from the state. Now she wants to bring that approach to the highest office in the land. Whoever Harris pretends to be this time, she cannot be, to use one popular Harris phrase, unburdened by what has been. This article is from 2019. It is from E&E Politico, Kamala Harris and her connection to inmate firefighters. As California Attorney General, Kamala Harris led a team that fought to keep more people in prison so they could fight wildfires. She said later that she was unaware of the effort. It began when federal courts ruled that California prisons were overcrowded. State attorneys in Harris's office said releasing low-level offenders more quickly would deplete a workforce that California relies to suppress wildfires. Harris later reversed that position, saying her staff attorneys had made the argument without her knowledge. Now, in her bid for the White House, Harris, a Democratic senator, has pitched a different approach for the country. She endorses mobilizing a massive response to climate change through the Green New Deal, especially for fighting bigger, more dangerous fires brought by rising temperatures. Harris's support for the Green New Deal and for prison labor are two answers to the same question. Who will do the extra work that climate change brings? California and many other states have for decades relied on low-wage convicts to pad out their fire crews, but activists who want the government to support well-paying green jobs as well as bipartisan efforts to reform criminal justice are challenging that system. The state of California has come to rely on prison labor to such a degree that it has affected state policy, said David Fathi, director of the National Prison Project for the American Civil Liberties Union. Harris, whose campaign did not respond to questions, has made wildfires a central element of her policy pitch on climate change. In the June presidential debate, she recalled meeting firefighters who left their own burning homes to battle blazes, calling it a critical issue, saying we must not confront what is immediate and before us right now. That is why I support a Green New Deal, she said. It is also the reason her office defended prison labor. In 2014, California had too many people in its prisons and too many dead trees around its towns. Both were coming to a head. The Supreme Court had upheld in a ruling that California violated the Constitution by imprisoning almost double the amount of people its facilities were designed to hold. Harris's office was in court arguing over what to do about it. At the same time, California was coming off a drought, and the winds were strong. It was perfect fire weather. Thousands of blazes spread across the strait, scrambling firefighters for a season that seemed unprecedented. Scientists blamed climate change for exuberating the problem, and they warned that the future would be worse. For decades, California has taken a two-birds-with-one-stone approach to these problems. It has trained about 2,600 prisoners to deploy alongside professional firefighters and do much of the same work for about $1 an hour. The fuck? While critics have compared that to slave labor, California said it's vital to fire suppression. Prisoners have at times accounted for about a third of the state's firefighting force. Men, women, and juvenile inmates live in more than 40 fire camps nestled around every corner of the state. During blazes, they cut fire breaks and light prescribed burns, the same kind of work as professional firefighters, only they wear orange uniforms instead of yellow California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. The work is hard and dangerous, but life in the camps is more relaxed than in the prison yard. Visitors can spend the night, and some camps have board games and barbecues. At least one has a children's playground. Alcohol is banned, but outside food is not. I've seen a ton of families take pre-made meals like pasta, salad, soups, all kinds of meats, carne asada, hot dogs, burgers. They take juice containers, a pack of soda, stuff to make their own sandwiches with, a woman wrote last year on the forum for prisoners, friends, and family. As long as you pack for a picnic, you'll be fine, she advised other visitors. The prisoners also get another perk, 2 days credit toward their sentences for every day working at the fire camp. That contribution to early release caught the attention of the 3-judge panel supervising California's crowded prisons. The state agreed to expand its work program to more minimum security inmates, not just the ones volunteering to fight wildfires. The court gave the state some wiggle room, but progress was slow. Eventually, civil rights advocates urged the courts to deliver an ultimatum. 1 day of work would shorten prison sentences 2 days. That's when Harris's office raised the alarm. California couldn't afford to lose the cheap prison labor, it argued. Extending 2-for-1 credits to all minimum custody inmates at this time would severely impact fire camp participation, a dangerous outcome while California is in the middle of a difficult fire season and severe drought, the Attorney General's office said in a September 30th, 2014 court filing. Releasing more minimum security inmates, what the state called higher turnover, would create vacancies for trash collecting, cleaning, and other critical jobs, Harris's office said. Those jobs would then be filled by inmates who might otherwise have volunteered for the harder, more dangerous work of firefighting. As a result, according to Harris's office, California would be forced to draw upon its fire camp population to fill these vital positions. The legal argument carried Harris's name, though it was signed by one of her top lieutenants, Patrick McKinney. He later became chief counsel for the state prison system and is now a judge on the Alameda County Superior Court. The court was skeptical, and after the Los Angeles Times published the state's arguments, Harris walked it back. I would be very candid with you, because I saw that article this morning and I was shocked, and I'm looking into it to see if the way it was characterized in the paper is actually how it occurred in court, Harris told BuzzFeed News. I was very troubled by what I read. I just need to find out what we did actually say in court, she said. One thing was made clear by her office's position. California is struggling to manage its fires. Flames climb up a wall of family photos as firefighters rush around, smoke billows around a rooftop, then the voiceover starts. California's State Firefighters Union aired ads this summer in Sacramento warning that wildfire risk was growing, a not-so-subtle message that the state needs more firefighters to keep up with the longer fire seasons. We've had extreme and unusual fire seasons over the last couple of years, Tim Edwards, president of CAL FIRE, Local 2881, said in the ad, and our firefighters are working long shifts to respond to these devastating emergencies. California Governor Gavin Newsom earlier this year announced that the state would hire almost 400 additional firefighters this season, bringing the force up to about 6,000. The state also has more 100 National Guardsmen tapped for firefighting. But this is still not enough, according to the union. Staffing is still below levels in 1975, when fire conditions were generally milder than today, and the warnings of Harris's office has been somewhat validated, according to officials. Fire camp participation is down. CAL FIRE says it's working hard to recruit inmates, while the firefighters union worries about drawing on prisoners with violent histories. With the release program and us trying to hold off allowing higher risk inmates, it's a huge hit, Edwards, the union president, said in an interview. Most fire camps are down at least one crew, which is about 15 inmate fighters, he said. Skeptics of using prisoners, also known as con crews, note that their cheap labor offsets other parts of the CAL FIRE budget. Part of the reason that they pay CAL FIRE captains so well is because they're paying the con crews $1 an hour, said Tim Inglesby, a former firefighter who's now an executive director of Firefighters Union for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation didn't respond to questions about the program, but a spokesman told Capital Weekly last year that inmate firefighters save the state up to $100 million a year. Prisoners deserve the chance to learn firefighting skills and help their community, Inglesby said. But their exploitative conditions and their limited options for continuing to work as firefighters after release point to the current system's problems, he said, but it could also offer an opportunity. Reducing wildfire risk will take a lot of work, and the greatest need is in rural areas where young people are fleeing for the lack of jobs. California does have a civilian conservation corps. Hard work, low pay, miserable conditions, and more, its website says, that Newsom has proposed expanding. The model could get supercharged under plans from Democratic presidential candidates like New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and Washington Governor Jay Inslee that would create thousands of jobs restoring forests. There's so much work that needs to be done, and how are you going to find the workforce for that? Well, it's standing by, get the right policies and the right funding and make it happen, Inglesby said. You could just pay people to fight the fires instead of using prison labor. Seems like the right thing to do. Thanks for watching.